Hello there, I am Mr. Brass, and today I want to go over notorious bad history popularizer Neil Degrasse Tyson. I was reading scientist Luke Barnes' blog post on this subject and became interested in the subject. A lot of what I say will play off his findings and I'll add to it myself. To begin with, Neil believes that having God on the brain breeds scientific ignorance and uses Isaac Newton as an example of this. Now, while admittedly not an atheist but rather an agnostic, Neil essentially promotes the same thing that guys in the new atheist movement do, which is the whole conflict thesis narrative. I'm going to play a short video clip of Neil's statements and I will respond to it accordingly.
Napoleon, if you visited his library, it's not just sort of books of world history and battles, it's engineering books, it's physics books. This man wanted to know where his cannonballs would land, all right? He was much more than just sort of a lucky general. He was into the physics, the engineering, and the material science of war. And so he immediately summoned up the 5-volume production of Laplace, read it through, cover to cover, called in Laplace, and said, "Sir, I have the exact quote here. Hang on. Napoleon asked him what role God played in the construction and regulation of the heavens. This is kind of like, that's what Newton would ask, right? Laplace replies, "Sir, I had no need for that hypothesis." And so what concerns me now is, even if you're as brilliant as Newton, you reach a point where you start basking in the majesty of God, and then your discovery stops. It just stops. You're kind of no good anymore for advancing that frontier, waiting for somebody else to come behind you who doesn't have God on the brain and who says, "That's a really cool problem, I want to solve it." They come in and solve it. But look at the time delay. This was a 100-year time delay. And the math that's in perturbation theory is like crumbs for Newton. He could have come up with that. The guy invented calculus just on a dare, practically. When someone asked him, Ike, how come planets orbit in ellipses and not some other shape? And he couldn't answer that. He goes home for 2 months, comes back, out comes integral differential calculus, because he needed that to answer that question. And so this is the kind of mind we were dealing with Newton. He could have gone there, but he didn't. He didn't. His religiosity stopped him. And so we're left with the realization, of course, that intelligent design, while real in the history of science, while real in the presence of sort of philosophical drivers, is nonetheless a philosophy of ignorance. And so, regardless of what our political...
So is this true? Was Isaac Newton falling into God of the gaps? No. For one, there are no eyewitness reports of Laplace saying such a thing. British astronomer William Herschel was in the room during the time, but doesn't record that story, but rather has it just saying that Laplace wanted to show that natural causes would account for his hypothesis. Laplace has been classified as a deist, an atheist, and an agnostic, which makes assessing the probability of him saying this harder. Laplace never denied God's existence in his writings as far as we can tell, and he mentioned God favorably at times, so generally it's thought that he was likely a deist and became agnostic at the end of his life, and thus it is unlikely that he would make such a statement. In fact, there is evidence that he hated this quote and sought to have it removed from publication. Astronomer Harvey Fay talked to Laplace's younger colleague, Francis Arago, and Francis told him that Laplace wanted the quote deleted. It seems like Laplace wasn't saying that God didn't exist, but rather that God didn't intervene and break the laws of science. The whole having an exact quote, as Neil Degrasse Tyson puts it, is BS, as I've stated, this story is at best a hearsay. Isaac Newton also developed 2 theories of perpetuations, which Neil Degrasse Tyson gets wrong here. William L. Harper points this out, who's a historian on the matter. The reason why Newton didn't go as far is that he lacked the right type of mathematics, aka the more algorithmic and global continental mathematics. Simply put, Newton's calculus wasn't as good or as advanced as guys like Leibniz or Laplace. Whether he was an atheist, pagan, Christian, etc., that would have been a problem for him. So, his belief in God had nothing to do with why he didn't break through with it. It was just where he was at the time and how advanced his calculus was. Also, Newton wouldn't be the type of guy to try to use God's gaps, as when he was pointing out the gaps in scientific knowledge regarding the power of gravity, he said, "I frame no hypothesis," and the whole appeal to optics doesn't hold water when you take into consideration that Newton was merely referring to God's orderly sustaining the universe and not appealing to miracles. It would be natural from our perspective. Newton saw God everywhere, and not just as a gap in scientific knowledge. He governed all things, aka the things we do know and the things that we don't know. What he knew and understood about nature informed him about God, not the lack of knowledge that did it for him. Now, what about that sentence in Optics where Newton appeals to God's intervention? Samuel Clarke argued that Newton's reformation, as talked about there, would be natural and merely part of God's orderly sustaining of the universe. Overall, Neil Degrasse Tyson's historical claims need work. That is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.